Welcome to the Pitchwerks Podcast. I'm Scot McTaggart. Over the last 20 years, I've been a sales rep, a marketer, a manager, an executive, a consultant, and an advisor. This show is designed to give you access to my list of contacts so that you can learn more about how to present your ideas at work and succeed in your career.
Startups and salespeople, marketers and managers from the Epicast Network in Pittsburgh. It's the Pitchwerks Podcast.
My father was a true steeler. He was a steel worker. Worked for Allegheny Ludlam, but he also worked for Gulf Oil. He also worked for West Penn Power. But in the meantime, he also was a plumber on the side. My father was always the master of hustles. He's like, never be dependent on someone to take care of your family. He just believed that. And he says, well, if this goes bad, then I always have this to fall back on.
I got a backup plan to my backup plan.
Exactly. And he would always be the type of person that when the mill would shut down, he would have all these plumbing jobs lined up. He would actually sometimes be upset that he'd be called back.
Happy Wednesday, everybody. It is time for the Pitchwerks Podcast. Thanks so much for tuning in. This week we're talking to Andrew Milisits from Atheris. If you're in the federal government space, particularly working with technology, you've probably heard of Atheris. They are about 14 years old now, and working with the federal government on tech projects is their claim to fame. Don't forget the Pitchwerks experience starts at pitchwerks.com. That's our website. That's where you're going to find everything that we do. That's our Pitchcraft blog. All of the podcast episodes are listed there. You can find a little bit of information about what other services are offered. Everything is on pitchwerks.com, pitchwerks. I'm sitting here in the Epicast studios with Andrew Milisits of the noted federal contractor, Atheris. Andrew, how you doing?
Doing fine. Thanks for asking.
I really wish I would have thought about how smooth your voice is and invited you earlier. You sound really good on that mic. First of all, let's make sure everybody's kind of caught up on exactly what it is that you're doing. And I mean, I gave you a warm intro there. I said, okay, you're the noted federal government contractor, but maybe you can give a better pitch for your own operation than I can.
Absolutely, Scott. So Atheris, we've been around since 2002. So we'll actually have our 14th anniversary is actually on the 17th of December.
Congratulations.
So yeah, it's been 14 years. And
I'm sure it only feels like 50.
And it's been smooth sailing since day one, as always.
Entrepreneurship is somewhat thankless.
But it's interesting is that one of the things that's interesting about it, as far as being a federal contractor, is in order to become a federal contractor, in order to get on the schedules and things, and I'll talk more about that, is that you have to start out in the commercial world first.
You need to have like a track record.
Absolutely. And the government, as in most things in life, nobody wants something that no one else wants.
Right. So nobody wants to go first? Is that what you're saying? Or maybe something?
Absolutely. And you want something to be tried and proven by someone else. The federal government does not want to be a beta customer when it comes to anything. So with that being in mind, you have to cut your teeth within the commercial world. You have to, hone your craft, figure out from a capability standpoint what you can offer, what works, what doesn't work. And then when you have more of a mature offering, then the federal government wants to talk to you. That includes pricing, all those things, because one of the things you have to validate when you're even going on bids on the federal side is you have to show at least 2 examples of that particular type of thing you're offering and differentiation between that pricing to prove that, hey, this wasn't a one-off, but this is actually part of my practice, and they can actually have viable and verifiable pricing as well as product offerings. So
everything you just said sounds entirely reasonable. Here's the part where I sort of struggle with it. Like there are certain people that are built for maybe selling things that only the government would need. There are certain people that are built for maybe only the way the government buys. I mean, does that bind people up?
There are folks who do better at it.
Right.
But you still have to have sort of your foundation within the commercial world, particularly when it comes to what we sell and what we do. I mean, we are a data management, records management, and IT offering. That's what we do. And people always seem to never think about and go back to the days when, at one time, the federal government was one of the greatest innovators when it came to public and private partnerships. I can even begin to tell you about the greatness of Bell Labs.
And
and without it, you're talking about the father and mother from a lab perspective of a good majority of a lot of the innovation, whether it's a space program, whether it's telecom, whether it's data management, whether it's security. Bell Labs was a public-private partnership that, was one of the biggest innovator or think tanks we've ever known within our society.
I grew up with these stories.
So, but those stories are the foundation of sort of where we are now. So, right there in New Jersey, which was sort of the foundation of a lot of things. I mean, let's not even talk about Lucent and Alcatel and all these other sort of entities that would spawn from that. So to say that things are better suited, I think everyone will find their niche and say, well, this is better. I'm better at this or I'm better at that. But you have to have both in order to succeed in the federal government, particularly when it comes to from an IT offering. Because nowadays you don't really have those public-private partnerships. So in order to have, again, something to show is innovation or show that can be proven, you have to have developed it within the commercial world. So small business sort of innovation is what they do. And you come up, you get your grant, and then they'll give you such a longer cycle when it comes to developing this innovation. Whereas if I'm doing it and I'm VC backed or I'm, M&A or even if I have a debt that's behind me, my window of time to innovate is much shorter to turn around. Whereas in the federal government side, I can actually use that time and have that. The federal government, though, requires one thing, that they get first right of use. You have to store that source code with them.
Yeah.
And, you can sell services and things around it, but the actual right of use belongs to them because you've innovated on their dime. And,
as an American, I'm actually pretty happy about this. Yeah, I'm not going to argue it.
Right. Now, the good thing about that is I can then take what I've developed and I can actually modify it for commercial use and have every right to be an American capitalist and sell that to potential viable commercial customers. So I say that it's a hybrid. You have to live in both worlds.
So take me back 14 years ago.
Okay.
Right? Everybody always likes to say in the garage, right? Mm-hmm. You're in some garage. Maybe it's a dining room table or whatever.
It is a dining room table. Actually, it is a table at the Stained Glass Pub off of Laytonsville Road outside of Silver Spring, Maryland.
All right.
So shout out to Stained Glass Pub.
The Stained Glass Pub. So you're sitting there.
Uh-huh.
At that point, what are your goals? What were your stated goals when you were sitting at the pub?
Stated goals were to basically create how do I say this? We were looking for a way, myself and the partners we had at the time, were to be a reseller of services to one of our large partners.
Okay, now at this point, you're talking about a private industry. Mm-hmm. The federal government wasn't on your radar.
No, it
and
wasn't.
You said there's an opportunity here where there's a large potential buyer.
Absolutely. So what we've done is that at that time, I was a 1099, which was as just an independent contractor. I'd already established myself as a contractor, and I've been an entrepreneur since the days of delivering the Valley News Dispatch out in New Kensington, as well as the Sunday Pittsburgh Press. For some people, that's how old I am.
I was a press guy too. Tread lightly on this one.
I was a press guy. I love the press.
Right after school, I used to deliver the press,
and so I got to the point where I realized that I could deliver more newspapers, take a cut off each person, and have more routes if I just managed the routes. So I've always been looking for ways.
You were so much smarter than I was. I used to read the paper when I walked, and that's all I wanted.
So I was always looking for ways to innovate. So in 2002, I had left sort of the entity that I was with, large entity, doing ERP and CRM work. And so basically it was myself as a single shingle, and I had met an individual who was a sales engineer for the large firm that we were working with, and he was telling me about the issues that they were having from a service delivery model. They could sell the software, but they didn't have a bench to develop to actually implement it. So as a lot of times...
And you got somebody explaining their pain point right there.
Absolutely. And I saw it because I was a 1099 overseeing these projects,
right,
waiting for staff to come, saw the high bill rates that they had, and there never was any knowledge transfer. It was a difficulty in getting them there because they would go to the highest bidder, and they were outsourcing because at the time, most software companies were 80-20. That 80% of the revenue comes from the sales of the actual software,
right,
and 20% comes from implementing it. and they would augment that with resellers and service delivery consulting firms. And we realized, hey, we can actually get into the middle of that, not be as high as them, be a little higher than those guys are from service delivery model, but actually show that we have a viable bench.
You know what I love about this story, though? Like, how many times have you heard the big corporate model being so stifling of entrepreneurship and like, oh, you can't get any creativity. There's no jazz that happens there, right? The problems are there to be solved. And if you can read those tea leaves, there's a ton of pain points just waiting to be solved.
Absolutely.
All right, so we're back. You're at the Stained Glass Pub, right?
Yes.
Who's at home at that point? Who do you have at home?
As far as my support network?
You're just like, when you go home, who lives there?
Oh, that's my wife and my, how old is she now? She'll be 19 this year, so
she would have been 5-ish.
She was 5, yeah. So, and my kindergartner. I had helped develop a single sign-on solution. Didn't get a whole lot of money for it. They cited work for hire, and I was like, okay, I get that. But I was traveling around the world helping to implement this solution that I helped co-develop. And I was married, had a 5-year-old. I was like, this is getting old. So
it's definitely a lot of work.
Right. So the company's, me as a 1099, before we started the full-fledged sort of company that we established, which I was a 1099 for a year, was, again, finding a solution to a problem. I had a customer who was implementing a CRM system, could not get local people to do it. And I basically got out of my non-compete. I said, look, I'll do it. And the customer was 5 miles down the road from my house. But in the meantime, I said, okay, I built up what my rate would be based upon what my living expenses. Plus, I created a 20% sort of slush fund or emergency fund on top of that. And that's how I built my rate and said, hey, this is my rate. I created my first contract with these guys based upon contracts that we had with other folks when I was with the large, and then I was rolling. But I said, you know what? I want to go beyond that. I went back to the paper route days. I didn't want to just deliver the papers.
Right.
I wanted to have, I'm not going to say it was, multi-level marketing, but I wanted to have other people underneath. So the idea, and it also dovetailed on the customer at the time. So we had my potential partner that we're developing this, who works for the large software company, who has a service delivery issue. I have my customer who I'm already working with, and they keep coming to me and saying, hey, Andrew, we need someone that actually knows Linux. We need someone that actually can do checkpoint firewalls. And I sat there, referred people to them, and I said, well, wow, wait a minute. If I was an employee, you would at least give me $1,000 bonus after 90 days. But me as a 1099, you give me nothing. So the third time, I said, okay, I'll give you the first 2 strikes.
Yeah.
But this third one, I basically created a logo, slapped it on the resume of the person I gave, and said, here's a person from my bench. Let's modify the contract that we had so we can actually then include that.
I'm dying to know how they reacted. So they get it. The logo's on it.
They were surprised.
Good.
They first were surprised.
How did they communicate that surprise?
It's like, oh, I thought you were just going to refer. And I says, but in my business, when you refer, you would at least get a percentage of the sale. You've given me nothing. So I had a friend of mine who actually had a recruiting firm who had a contract to do this. So the first thing I learned was what you do is you put your logo on, you call them candidate 1. You give them a synopsis. You don't put the names. You don't put the contact information. And so I went back to my Rolodex in my mind, and that's what I did. I submitted it, and they really wanted the person. I got them, salivating about it and things like that. And then they finally said, okay, fine. What's their rate?
Now, how old are you at this point?
I'm 46 now. So that was 14 years ago. So I was 32.
Okay. So, yeah, still pretty... I mean, don't take this the wrong way. Still pretty green, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So a lot of this kind of probably felt like you were maybe putting things at risk. That like felt like a gamble. Say, like when you sent the logo over on top of the resume instead of the name.
It did feel like a gamble, but in a lot of ways not. I mean, my upbringing is such that my father was a true steeler. He's a steel worker. Worked for Allegheny Ludlam, but he also worked for Gulf Oil. He also worked for West Penn Power. But in the meantime, he also was a plumber on the side. My father was always the master of hustles. He's like, never be dependent on someone to take care of your family. He just believed that. And he says, well, if this goes bad, then I always have this to fall back on.
I got a backup plan to my backup plan.
Exactly. And he would always be the type of person that when the mill would shut down, he would have all these plumbing jobs lined up. He would actually sometimes be upset that he'd be called back. And then he would take his paid vacation in order to finish these jobs.
I've done that. I did it for consulting gigs, but same thing.
So because of that, we always ate. He just always hustled. So for me, I was a credit risk analyst. I worked on Wall Street, helping develop derivative products. I did computer programming. I was a bartender. I've delivered pay. I mean, it was just whatever hustle there was, do it so that you have some sort of control of your life, control the means of your economics, as well as constantly honing your skills.
How much time passed between the Stained Glass Pub and the first attempt at starting to work with the federal government?
That was, believe it or not, that was actually about 3.5 years.
That's a pretty short timeline,
3.5
from what
years.
I've seen, at least.
And through a lot of the network that we did, through the partnership that we had with, and it was a software testing company, large one that was acquired by another large entity, is that we established a lot of relationships and we went on the ground, basically, win the hearts of the masses. So we joined user groups. That's where real stuff happens. User groups of these software and the solutions. And again, it goes back to having that pain point. They'll tell you exactly. You can have all of the marketing and paraphernalia and things like that, but those who are on the ground, who are the users of the software, the beta customers, as we say, will tell you, well, that's great, and it's shrink wrapped, and I inserted the CD and I loaded it, but this is what really happened, and we need people to do this. So through that, so in the user groups, we actually met someone who actually worked with a large system integrator, who then said that, and it was basically on the large TSA contract when they finally stood TSA up. They had huge data centers they had to stand up, and through that, we established ourselves in the federal government as a subcontractor to one of them, because a lot of these subcontractors, actually a lot of the prime contractors, they're the thinkers.
Right.
More from a white collar perspective, they manage, their thought leaders and things like that. But someone needs to do the code.
Yeah, somebody's actually got to do
someone has to code and things like that. So because of that, they look to us. And it's interesting. We have similar relationships today where, they focus more on the process management and the business process re-engineering, but then someone actually has to do the code and actually do the architecting of the solution. So that's where we saw our in. And we established ourselves by doing a lot of the application testing associated with the TSA system that you see today, which actually checks folks in.
And that's a tremendous
no-fly list,
name to be able
things.
to drop.
Right. So that was sort of our first federal contract.
And it's why you're a famous federal contractor. Now, I got to ask you a question, though.
Yes.
No jokes aside, I mean, this is 100% real.
Right.
So you just basically spilled the beans on a secret, right? You said, pay attention to the user groups and it'll make you money.
Well,
right?
You have to. You have to pay attention to user
okay,
groups.
but I fully intend to distribute this through the interwebs.
Oh, that's fine.
Okay.
And here's the thing. We see these folks at the user groups all the time, but just because you may know something exists doesn't mean that you know how to navigate it.
Make no mistake, I'm super happy to pass this kind of stuff on to my audience.
No, seriously.
But one of the things that's important, though, is that people understand the potency of it, because I agree with you. I think user groups are this undervalued resource where someone will tell you something that otherwise would cost you literally tens of thousands of dollars to learn.
Right.
You would have to pull together a focus group. You'd have to do the dialing for dollars where you're like, hi, this is Sam, and I'd like to know whether or not Mary's available to answer a few questions about X, right? Mm-hmm. And then Mary gets on the phone and she's like, well, I'm not really the right person. You really want to talk to John. John passes you to Tom. And by the time you get to the actual end of the conversation, you get some weird sliding scale, like from 1 to 5. How would you rate your satisfaction with the user interface on this particular, software application or this process, right? When you get a user group together, I like the way they riff off each other. I like the way they talk and they compare notes. Mm-hmm. They say, did you get that same bug with the latest update?
Absolutely.
Or did you notice that every time you try to get your Active Directory connected to it, everything goes haywire? And now, if you're smart, you're not sitting there grinning and shaking hands. You're actually taking notes.
Absolutely.
It is a super valuable thing. And I expect that you would know it, but I don't necessarily expect that everyone listening to this, especially everyone that sees themselves maybe someday in your shoes, understands what a gift those user groups can be. So
one of the things we've had matured on, Scott, is the fact that you have sort of the transactional sort of retail approach and you have the custom. We're actually going more into the middle where we've actually been able to repeat in some of the transactional stuff more on our hardware sort of solutions, sort of the net appliance things that we've been doing based upon lessons we've had from custom, realizing that there's been a pattern even within the custom stuff that there's a few things that a disparate group of customers are asking for, and we can actually make that repeatable. So we've been able to actually do that, which enabled us to hit singles while we're trying to swing for the fences on his home run, but knowing that you got to bat for average, you got to get some people on base.
What you called transactional business. Like I remember when I got started carrying a bag, I wasn't allowed to have anything vary from the norm.
Right.
So once upon a time, I worked for a company, which is now part of Verizon, but when we needed special terms or whatever, we had to call a lawyer in Atlanta to read it. It didn't matter what the special term was.
Right.
If you ever strayed off of like the boilerplate, it's like there's a BD guy in Atlanta, you call him and he'll tell you whether or not it's blessed. And it would take like 2 weeks.
Okay.
So we'd eventually maybe get it back with approval, or we'd get the counter, right? You know, it comes back and it's like, okay, well, he wanted 90 days, but we'll give him 51 days.
Right.
Like, it was always haggling. And then you get to the other end, right? Where the federal government comes to you and they go, hey, look, it has to come in blue. I guarantee you, Andrew Milisits is running that hallway going, paint it blue, fellas, paint it blue. Because it's the most important thing happening that day.
Right. So to that end, Scott, it's when you said, paint it blue, the first thing we ask internally, and this is where, I would say it's part of the advice part as far as the salespeople, is that you have to know that what you're selling is viable and possible.
Yes.
Okay. Within the federal space, reputation is everything. They have this thing called the Contract Performance Database. So CPARS is what it is. And, your name is put in there, and there is actually a reference to detail what
it's like a credit score.
It really is. And it's available to all other contracting officers and individuals who manage bids on the federal side.
Is it visible to you?
It is visible to me.
Okay, so you can at least see, like, if something shows up on there that's not accurate.
And I can review it
then
before they put it in, and then I can provide my comments. We come to agreement, but their word is bond. And a lot of these bids that you have that you're going after, they're checked. Just like I'm applying for a loan.
Right.
They're checked, and you have to have at least 2 to 3 of that particular capability of what you're trying to bid on certain bids, and they look at those things. And we know. I'll give you an example. We know when things are going well on a bid is that we'll get a sort of a heads up that, hey, they checked our CPARs. That means we've made it past. They like what we said. Now they're trying to see, are we who we say we are? So when I say the whole thing of painted blue, the first thing I ask is, do we have blue paint? And if we don't have blue paint, does one of our trusted partners who we work with has blue paint?
Right.
That's just key. And going back to that whole thing as far as, let's stay on the theme of, can I do this? The whole concept of the blue paint, we also have to show that, did we paint before? Right. And how well did we paint? Those things are key. And I like you utilizing the whole thing as far as the paint, because I think it should be tried and true for any business.
Well, and I'm going to put you on the spot for a second. When you do a large project, like I'm not talking about your maintenance that you would come back and do, right? Put me in the neighborhood of what an average ticket is for a new project for Atheris, when, say, somebody puts something out on the street for you to either bid on, or you do like a design build. I assume you have sometimes where they ask you what the solution should be. I mean, are we talking $500,000, $5 million, $50 million? Where are we on an average ticket size for a project engagement?
All those.
All of those. Yeah.
All of those. I mean, we've gone after some bids that are, $70 million over 5 years. Mm-hmm. We have contracts that are multiple years that will be in the millions. We've gone after some other work that's been much smaller.
Well, I ask because obviously it's important to know who you're buying from when you're spending $70 million over 5 years.
Absolutely. Now, what we try not to do, though, is that, again, from an opportunity cost perspective, we try not to go after bids which are too small. We have found that the amount of time it takes to implement a small deal and a large deal are the same.
Understanding that you're talking about, tens of millions of dollars in many of these cases. Mm-hmm. How do you bring somebody into your culture and make sure that they're onboarded appropriately?
We don't hire salespeople off the street.
Right.
Interesting enough, we create invitations to salespeople to come, and we call them really client development leads. Mm-hmm. And we only bring in folks that we've worked with before in some capacity. And this goes back to the ecosystem of partnerships. So basically our leads. And we only, and the other thing is we hire adults. We are an organization that we provide a bevy of training opportunities, mentoring, but we like to hire peers. We're a flat organization. This is not a regime.
You don't want to
speak.
micromanage.
I want adults. I want to learn something. It's good to great and built to last. Level 5 leadership. I want to surround myself with people who are better and smarter than me all day, twice on Sunday. And they have to know the information before anyone else knows it. And that requires, them to what we call sort of a capture process, where we're capturing that information, and they have to be very good at it. And that information we have to validate it. And a lot of times when we have not succeeded, it was something that we thought was this way, but it really wasn't.
Right.
When it comes to that, because you develop your entire plan to go after a bid based upon that captured data and what's going on with the incumbent. And that's where, so when you say, what do we look for in folks? We look for those who are not malleable, but adaptable.
I'm curious, do you use a sales manager?
We have a sort of a sales manager, but we have more. They're all starting pitchers, and they're all part of our rotation.
Yes,
and based upon the matchup that night is who we'll put on the mound.
Right.
I would say, from a sales manager perspective, from a pipeline perspective, that would be my business partner, Ben Hankins.
Okay.
He manages that, and it's interesting is that we know, and people sometimes think that I'm one of the better salespeople in the company, but I'm not a sales guy whatsoever.
Right.
We are problem solvers, and we are solution providers first and foremost. There's not a single day that I'm selling.
Yeah, but you know the product
right.
well enough that you can match up a pain
right.
point. And again,
Absolutely.
if you've got a good qualified lead,
right?
Like I always like to say, the CEO is the best salesperson in any company because they know the product and they also know where the product's headed.
Absolutely.
And they know why the product is what it is. So for them, matching up a pain point to an offering, way simpler to somebody who just got, hired in a batch of 3 where you're only going to keep one.
Absolutely.
Right. That person's still trying to figure out where the restroom is. You're stuck in an elevator, and the person that can change the future of the company, expand the company by 10, is standing there. You don't know what their pain point is. You don't know anything about them. What's the one thing you can tell them to get their interest in evaluating a therapist? I would tell people the TSA story.
Yeah.
If it was me, because if I read that correctly, 3.5, 4 years in, you had a TSA contract.
Right.
I like that as a headline.
Well, it's funny, the one from a story perspective, when I think of problem solving, and I can say this because it's out there, it's on our website. We worked on Arlington National Cemetery.
The Arlington National Cemetery has, how many people are there?
Well, it's well over 500,000, and there were some interesting challenges that we had to go through as far as making sure that the data was clean, the data represented who was there, because that data was actually fed to the visitor center, on which you go and you try to find where this soldier was buried and that soldier, and to solve sort of the myriad of issues that they had. And this thing was a congressional mandate. This thing was on 60 Minutes. It was all those sorts of things associated with it. And here they entrusted this small firm to come in. We went to the Dog and Pony Day.
Right.
And we're there, and everybody's saying, a lot of our competitors are saying how they can automate this. So we were the only ones that went in there and said, you can't use automated OCR. You're talking about index cards that some of these things, if they hit air and touch human fingers with oil in it, they'd be destroyed.
Absolutely.
So that was, again, listening to what was really there, using experience from things that we've had, and being entrusted to deal with something that is incredibly integral. I mean, the last thing that you want is, for these men and women who made the ultimate sacrifice, to not have their data correct.
Right. Can you imagine?
And we had to pretty much, this was not a 99.99% quality assurance. This was every record must be accurate.
Now, you see that, I agree with you. That is actually a much better headline. if I were in the elevator and it were my job to spur interest in your company, that's the headline I'd lead with. I would say, you may have heard of us on 60 Minutes, or you may have heard the problem that we solved.
The problem that we solved.
Sorry, don't want to overstep.
Because just so you know, I was excited when we would see things in the press and they would use the words, the contractor. I was like, oh, yes, the contractor.
just in case.
We may be that contractor.
Back up to a backup, right? You got to have your plans all set. No, but that's a great headline. That opens up the door for, like, basically, if you have anyone at Arlington National Cemetery, my firm is the one that had the scope of work laid out before us, that we couldn't lose people, right? We couldn't be,
You couldn't lose records.
We can't misplace
data was clean. We had to make sure it was clean and it was in there so that you could go into the visitor center. So that data that's in the visitor center that's pulled up through that machine to find, that's the data that we scrubbed, cleaned, and put into the proper systems.
Andrew Milisits, Atheris, thank you so much for coming in. I can't tell you, like, how impressive it is to be able to talk to you about on this program the Arlington National Cemetery and some of these other major projects, knowing that what you're telling my listeners is you started at the Stained Glass Pub 14 years ago, and now look. So thank you for coming in. Thank you for spending the time.
Thank you, Scott.
It's so valuable having someone like that come into the studio where I can see them face to face and we can have such a deep, detailed conversation about their history and how they like to go to market and what successes they've had. Don't forget, we're in the show business, which means that we cannot live without your validation and approval. I need rates and reviews. Get into Google, get into iTunes, whatever your podcatching application is, and just press the buttons. Do it for me.
The Pitchwerks Podcast comes to you from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, a production of the Epicast Network and McTaggart, LLC. Engineering and production by Buzzy Torek and Nick Miller. For more information, show feedback, and ad sales, visit pitchwerks.com. pitchwerks.com. On social media, find and follow the show on Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, and Instagram using that same brand name, pitchwerks.